the ability to organize a broad coalition and work with progressive organizations who have all exclusively endorsed our candidacy to get it done. Thank you.
Representative Omar, the next question is for you. What is your reaction to recent news accounts that Congressman Keith Ellis' girlfriend is accusing him of domestic abuse, which he denies?
I think for us right now, it is really important for us not to politicize the pain of what she's going through, and I want to make sure that we are giving her time to really take care of herself and receive care for her health, and so I will reserve my opinions until I am certain that she is in a good place to.
Similar view. I have known Keith Ellison for about 16 years now, and we run together. I ran for the Senate and he ran for the U.S. House, and we have been campaigning for a very long time. And I know his children, I know his former wife, and what else is going to come next. And clearly, it's very painful to hear. So Karen Monahan describing what she's describing, and I take that very seriously. And for me right now, I think because this is a serious issue, I need to pause and just take some time to really see what's coming next.
Former Speaker Anderson Kelleher.
I agree largely with my colleagues up here that this is a very painful situation. I've actually known Karen, Keith, Kim Ellison, their families for a long time. I served in the House with Keith, and I think that we need more information in this situation. And the hardest part of this is we have an election tomorrow where Keith's name appears on the ballot, and we're not going to be able to resolve all the issues around this because of the pain that Karen is feeling. And I just have to say we have a lot left to understand in this situation.
Former Speaker Anderson Kelleher, let me follow up with you. A national women's organization, Ultraviolet, has come out and called for Congressman Ellison to withdraw from his campaign for Attorney General and to resign from Congress. Are you concerned that your unwillingness to take a stand on this could be perceived as condoning sexual abuse?
Well, I think that if you listen to my words of what I said, I'm quite concerned about domestic violence and power imbalance in this situation. The problem is we're not going to be able to resolve it within the next 24 hours in any way that's going to make any party be able to get more of the information out there. I think that there needs to be more information, and parties need to say how they would like to proceed with these allegations, which are serious, very serious.
Representative Omar, do you agree with this national women's organization that has called for Keith Ellison to resign from Congress and withdraw from his race?
In my previous statements are very clear. I want to respect whatever it is that Karen and her children and the families would like the outcome to be and how they would like to proceed.
Senator Torres-Ray, are you concerned that your position could be perceived as condoning sexual abuse?
About that. And I will always support the role of women's organizations and activist organizations to demand immediate response. That's the role that they need to play. Without their very concrete demand, people don't respond. So I fully support the role that they play and the role that they play in demanding action. How Keith will respond to that and how we respond to the work that we need to do with women and with Karen. That is an individual response that we need to take. So it is not an easy thing to do, and the immediacy of the actions that we have to take based on a report that is pretty is very serious. This is not a simple thing. So we asking for a pause for a moment is not a simple task for anyone, especially for us as having this responsibility as elected officials.
Okay, we'll now turn to our panel of questioners. Ms. Jane DeSenza has got the first question, and Senator Torres-Ray, it's for you.
Good afternoon. We've heard you all speak about your support for legislation to improve background checks on gun purchases, ban assault weapons, and close the gun show loophole. There's no need for us to go there again today. Please give us 2 specific steps you would take in Congress to build bipartisan support and pass gun control legislation.
There are 2 aspects to this for me. One, I think you are going to find that we have agreement on background checks, that we need to ban assault weapons. Clearly, we are opposed to arming teachers, so you're going to find very similar answers with this on this issue. I think what is very important, too, is that we look at who is funding our campaigns. When we make a commitment to do these major reforms and really promise to you that we're going to do this, you really need to look at who is funding our campaigns. I find it very difficult to talk about this reform if the NRA is involved in providing resources to campaigns and doing campaign contributions. It has gone as far as military weapons, and the connection between the companies that are involved with the NRA is very profound. So for me, the issue of how do we resolve this is to really look at how do we, when we make this commitment to these reforms, we also look at how we receive funding and how we respond to the people who are funding our campaigns.
Representative Omar.
So I think Senator Patricia Torres-Ray is correct in this. We have to make sure that we are loosening the grip that the NRA really has on Congress. And I think we are halfway there. We've seen what the pressures really look like, the kind of conversations that young people are having around our country and what that has meant. But I also think if we're really serious about getting honest reforms, we have to make sure that we are funding organizations and the departments that are in charge of making sure that this gets done. So we know that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives is severely underfunded. So we want to make sure that they are fully funded so that they can have the kind of database that allows them to be able to track. And we have to make sure that we are dealing with the bullying epidemic that's happening, that we have programs within our communities that also lessens violence. So that's going to be really important.
Thanks, Jane, for the question. I think that you'll find no distance between us on any of the high-level solutions on this. I think the question's a good one about making sure you understand what kind of coalition builders we are and how we are able to work together with other people. So one of the ways that I have found in my experience is being able to collect data and information is often a way to bring people together, because when they have the information in front of them, things like the CDC being able to actually do research and data collection on gun violence is going to be important here to get a bipartisan solution on these issues. The ability of the Bureau to actually make sure that local law enforcement is putting the information into the databases is going to be more helpful in a lot of ways than it has been today. We know that that is one of the biggest issues that we've seen in these mass shootings and in any shooting is the...
So some members of Congress have indicated that they would vote against legislation banning bump stocks because the legislation doesn't go far enough.
Fact.
Would your approach be an incremental one, or would you be in favor of an all or nothing solution?
I think that I would be more in favor of an all-in-all solution, because I think that we have heard from the American public that in reality, the issue for these weapons and what we need to do as a nation, not only to increase, the age, to really look at background checks and all of that, is very well supported, really by the majority of the people in this country. So I don't see why we will go into this as an incremental step. I think 78% of the country is in favor, and the solution is clear. Even the people who are hunters and really want to have access to hunting equipment and guns are in agreement with this. So for me, the incremental step at this point does not make sense. I think we need to go really far into doing the clear restriction.
Representative Omar and Ms. DeSenda, do you want to ask the same question?
Yeah, same for all three of you.
I think an all or nothing approach would be mine. It shouldn't be any reason why we need ammunition or weapons that could cause the deaths of many. I am someone who was in high school when Columbine happened. I have a daughter right now that's in high school. I grew up in urban neighborhoods. I understand what it means for us to move towards having sensible gun laws. And I think it's really going to be important for us to make sure that we are having a conversation with people for what the Second Amendment really is supposed to be. It's supposed to be about your protection. It's supposed to be about the right to have arms, but not the right to have the ability to kill mass numbers of people. And there is no need for the kind of weapons and ammunition right now that are on the market.
I think this goes back to a values question about how we stand up for the values that we care about. And I believe caring for humanity and other people means that we have to push hard on this issue, at least as bills come out of the House and Senate. They need to be the strongest possible, because right now we have a chief executive who is not going to be keen on signing any of this. And so to push harder, you actually need to be more inclusive in the legislation that you're putting together. In my own neighborhood in Bryn Mawr in 2012, we experienced a mass shooting that left 5 people dead and many people injured at Accent Signage. And this is one of those things that, legislation just around bump stocks doesn't do it for me.
Next question begins with former Speaker Anderson Kelleher, and our questioner is Ms. Molly Binger.
In June, the city of Minneapolis called for a transition to 100% renewable electricity for city operations by 2022. What strategies would you advocate for at the national level to work toward promises of 100% renewable energy?
So thank you, Molly, for the question. And this is one of those areas that I can tell you I have a strong passion around. When I was Speaker of the House, the very first bill that we worked on, major legislation in 2007, was to do, first of all, a forum on the House floor with the bishop of the Lutheran Church, the leader of the Catholic Church, imams, other environmental leaders, to talk about climate change and to be able to bring people on board to pass what was at the time the country's the leading renewable energy standard that has created both investment, jobs, and helped us reduce carbon in our economy here in Minnesota. So I believe that we can get there as a country in terms of being able to have a transition plan that gets to 100% renewable. We've seen it here in Minnesota, how at first people said, no, we can't even get to the 25%, but we now see that this is something that we can do. So I support what Minneapolis has done, and I hope that we can do this nationally.
Representative Omar.
Well, I'm honored to have been part of the Minneapolis plan to get us towards 100% renewable energy when I worked for Councilmember Andrew Johnson in Ward 12. And I think it's really going to be important for us to recognize that we can't just talk about a 10-year plan, 20-year plan, that we need to create the kind of real investments so that we could usher it in a lot sooner as well. And I think, you know, coalitions are going to be really important. Organizations that work around environmental justice and protecting our environment are going to be vital part of pushing for something nationally. And that's why organizations like the Sierra Club and MN 350 believe that I would actually be the candidate and the congressperson to be able to do that. And that's why they've endorsed our candidacy.
Senator Torres-Ray.
I am incredibly supportive of it, and I'm very proud of our city. I actually chair when we were in the majority, state and local government, because I think it gave me an opportunity to really understand how the state can support initiatives like this. I think that the direction that we're moving in as a nation, where the innovation and the demands for a market start at the local level, are very, very important, especially during times like this, that politically we don't have the will and the desire at the national level to do more investments. And so when I'm in office, I want to move in that direction where we provide more incentives and more funding for in these industries. But right now, I think that what Minneapolis is doing is absolutely essential, because what they are doing is really promoting a market and really opening opportunities for demand. And when that happens, then the industries have to develop and they will generate the investments that are necessary. So for me, this is something that we really need to do more of, and really applaud the efforts of the local communities that are moving in this direction, because that will change the market.
Ms. Binger, follow-up question. This is for former Speaker Anderson Kelleher.
A number of states have been proceeding with legislation on carbon pricing, but the federal government so far has avoided the topic. How would you build support within Congress for this market-based approach to reducing carbon emissions? And where would you advocate spending any revenues collected?
So, Molly, the follow-up is very good, because I think that in the question was actually part of the answer, which is with states being able to pass their own legislation, it pushes the federal government towards acting on a carbon reduction plan, with being able to, you know, whether it can be a revenue neutral carbon plan. We've seen plans like that. We've also seen plans that produce some revenue into the system. I think those revenues, any revenues produced, have to go mainly in three places. One, further carbon reductions, because we have other sources of carbon that may be harder to get out of the system, so there may need to be more incentive to reduce. Second, transition for workers who work in carbon-heavy industries, who need to transition to a different way of working. Norway has actually done this very well in their oil coast. And then I'm going to run out of time, so I'll just stop there.
Ms. Binger, did you have the same follow-up question for all the other candidates?
Yeah.
Representative Omar.
There's a theme to how this works. No, I really think it is going to be important for us to use, right, cities that have their own plans. Municipalities are going to be a big part of having conversations with their congressional leaders. It's going to be the states that are going to do that. And I think that's how we get congressional leaders to be on board and make sure that we are also utilizing organizations that are working on environmental justice to make sure that they're having the proper conversations with congressional leaders in order to get this done. And I think in the ways that I would invest it is make sure that, you know, some of the money is going for further carbon reduction, that we are using some of the money for what I advocate for, which is a federal jobs guarantee, and making sure that we have more green jobs and a Green Deal.
And Senator Torres-Ray, just to restate the question, with the follow-up question, how would you build support within Congress for this market-based approach, and how would you spend any revenues that are collected from it?
So absolutely, I think that building a coalition of support for carbon pricing is something that I will get behind 100%. But also, I think parallel to that, we do need to do carbon reduction. I think that those are imperatives. And I think the coalition for doing this is in place. I think our young generations, our millennials, the students are choosing not to drive. And I think this is where the incentives need to go. And that's where I will put my investments and my energy is to really figure out how do we open transit? How do we invest in an infrastructure that really allows us to use systems of transportation that reduce, that do carbon reduction. So I think that is an essential component and it needs to go hand in hand. So the investments that I will look into for carbon pricing will go directly into developing the infrastructure that will really facilitate the carbon reduction. So they need to go hand in hand, and the plans really need to be tied together because that's essentially what we want to accomplish in terms of the carbon reduction.
Next,
1 minute goes so fast. My brain doesn't work as fast with the words.
It goes fast for us too. It's too much fun. The next question it starts with you, Senator Torres-Ray, and it's from Ms. Ilana Pulowski.
Hi. So you've all expressed support for single-payer healthcare or Medicare for all. The conservative Mercatus Center and the liberal-leaning Urban Institute both have estimated that a Medicare for all system would cost $32 trillion over 10 years. How would you propose paying for those reforms?
So I have the paper right in front of me because these numbers are 1, 2, 3. And Bernie Sanders actually put the numbers together for us. So he made it very easy. And so I have copied these numbers and really put it together. So the actual number is 2.1 trillion. And it has been, he's done, there are multiple organizations that have worked with him to really put this number down to, the number. So right now, you need to know that we pay 3.6 trillion, right? So we pay a lot more and get a lot less. And I think that's the point we have been trying to make all along. And in order to really put this system in place, we already have the funding that is necessary. So if you take a look at Medicare for people over 65, you have $612 billion that already, just in one group, we're already paying for it. So the answer is very simple. We have the resources in place to pay for it, and we have the policy that we can propose in order to take care of it. We just have to act responsibly and make sure that those investments and the dollars that we're putting now in place go to where they need. So, a minute is not enough to talk about healthcare reform, but I want you to please take a look at what Bernie Sanders has proposed, because whether you agree or disagree with him and other policies, this is one that has been very well researched, and we do know how to pay for it.
Former Speaker Anderson Kelleher.
Can you repeat the number that you cited?
Yes, $32 trillion over 10 years. Than a Medicare for all policy. Mm-hmm. That's the cost.
So I am a supporter of Medicare for all, and I believe that it's doable in a couple of different ways. One is what you're doing is you're expanding the current Medicare system out. So you are taking, now we have students who are able to stay on parents' health care until they are 26 years old. They would be eligible right away to go into the system, and you'd start to lower the age down to be able. The advantage of this over other ideas out there is that it is a built system that we can build upon. The other part is rolling back the tax cuts that have been put in place. These outsized tax cuts for corporations and individuals are out of line with our values. And I think our values are to cover all people in the U.S. with health care and make sure it's quality health care.
Representative Omar.
So in the Minnesota House, I joke with a lot of my Republican colleagues that they practice in fake math. And I think it's really important that oftentimes when we're having conversations about how to pay for things and how much things cost, that we actually have real honest conversations about what the actual cost is and what it means for us to now invest in public and what it means for us to invest in the private, and how it's not comparable, right? And the kind of growth that has happened with our public healthcare and with our private, it's actually more that we're paying in when it comes to private. And I think when we're talking about our budgets, I think are an example of our values. And so we want to make sure that we are living out our values when we put our budgets together. And our values are that we want to make sure that no one is dying because they can't afford insulin, or that people are not going bankrupt because they got sick. And so we want to make sure that we're infusing our budgets with our conversations about our real values as Americans.
Senator Torres-Ray, follow-up question from Ms. Pawlowski.
United Health, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Medica, and UCare, all health insurance companies, employ over 23,000 people in Minnesota. Does a Medicare for All policy put the health insurance industry and those jobs at risk?
I don't think so, but I think you put into question something that I think is very, very important, and I think is something that we really need to take a look at. Right now, when we talk about access to insurance, that is the fight, and you will see our reports in terms of funding and who's funding our campaigns, and you will realize that the insurance companies right now are really calling us to fund our campaigns and really trying to make sure that they are on board with our campaigns, because they know that in order to really implement Medicare for All, that is the very question that they are going to be asking. Where are the insurance companies going to go? So the short answer to your question right now is really take a look at our reports and take a look at who's funding us. And that will give you the answer about where do we stand in terms of how are we going to serve you or the insurance companies. That's my response to that.
Former Speaker Anderson Kelleher.
So I think you should know that no one up here is accepting corporate PAC money, as far as I am aware, unless something has changed. And actually, I don't know many people who've called me to give me money right now. So I'm usually calling them. They don't want to answer the phone. They definitely don't want to answer the phone right now. But to answer your question, those jobs are important jobs in Minnesota. I think that many of them will exist because many of you who are on Medicare know already it's not a perfect system today. There is private health insurance that rides along Medicare. I have a 94-year-old mother. I know that her premiums for her both Part D, the prescription drug portion of Medicare, as well as her private supplement, has gone up. And on 94 years old on Social Security, it is difficult to afford. But a Medicare for All system does mean that there is still going to be a private insurance market out there for supplementary insurance. And so I don't know if it changes the numbers of those jobs, but I do know that under that system, they would still exist. It's different than a single payer system.
Representative Omar, the question again is the risk of losing 23,000 jobs in the healthcare industry in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I think it is really important for us to worry about, right? Like what that means for our communities and what it means for Minnesota. But I think it's also important for us to recognize that moving to a public system will also allow us to have some of those jobs transfer, because there will be the creation of other jobs within that. So right now, when we're talking about moving away from like the fossil fuel industry, we're advocating for environmental justice and green jobs. That's also a transfer, and so it's important for us to remember that this model of scarcity is really destroying all of us. That because you move away from one system doesn't mean that you lose. It just means that we are creating a new industry. We are allowing people to get jobs that just benefit all of us and create prosperity for all of us.
Representative Omar, the next question is for you, and it's from Ms. DeSenza.
The infant mortality rate in Minnesota for babies born to Black and Indigenous mothers is more than twice that of the infant mortality rate of babies born to white mothers. What specific legislation will you pursue in Congress to eliminate health disparities like this one, but also more broadly?
So as everybody knows, I talk about my sister who's in healthcare, and she used to run the clinic here, People Center, which is next door. And her and I oftentimes talk about how infant mortality actually is very much closer here to the United States than in most of third world developing nations, which for us as immigrants never really made sense. And so what I want to make sure is that we are recognizing it and that we are investing in these communities. We are making sure that mothers have access to reproductive education, that they have the ability to access prenatal care, that they have an opportunity to live in housing that is free of lead, that we are creating walkable communities so that we have less pollution. And I think we have to recognize that there are societal impacts that are happening that are creating the kind of infant mortality that exists within particular communities.
Former Speaker Anderson Kelleher.
Well, thank you for that question, Jane. I think that one of the proven things in research that's out there is birth support. And so I think every woman in the United States, whether they are a woman who is covered by Medicaid or private health insurance, should be allowed and actually have access to birth support. And that can mean a doula, that can mean a nurse midwife, a certified nurse midwife, and that alone can help reduce the infant mortality rate. I also think that good nutrition is really important here. And I do know that one of my colleagues was a WIC educator on the stage here. My sister-in-law was a WIC educator for years as a pediatric nurse. And I think good nutrition is also very important. And there's also some technology about being able to text with mothers who are being able to make sure they're keeping up with appointments and things like that.
Senator Torres-Ray.
I believe that this is one of the most important questions that we need to respond to, because infant mortality is just one issue. But if you look at the disparities that exist in this state, they are the worst in the nation. We have the best indicators of well-being in almost every issue. We are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But when you separate people of color and indigenous people, we are 48, 49, and 50 in the nation. I have been talking about this issue for 27 years. I ran for office because I wanted to have an impact on this issue. And what I am going to tell you right now is that if you don't have people who have these perspectives and who are connected to communities of color, we are not going to eliminate these persistent disparities that have existed in this state for as long as I have been here. So I believe it is an imperative that we bring people with these backgrounds to these tables of power. I tell you from my experience in the Minnesota Senate, when I am not at the table, this conversation does not take place. My colleagues are good people, progressive Democrats who really want to serve, but they don't know how to do this work. So I think it's an imperative that you bring people with these perspectives who have done extensive research in disparities and have the answer. And so I think it's important that we incorporate diverse voices in creating policy. It's an imperative today.
Representative Omar, you get the first follow-up question from Ms. DeSenza.
And this will be for all three of you. What qualifications or specific experiences are in your past that show that you have the ability to improve health equity broadly?
Well, that's a perfect question. As was mentioned, I used to work for the U of M's Extension Department here as a nutrition educator and worked with many parts of our communities, working here in Minneapolis, mainly in North Minneapolis. I worked in Hennepin County, in Anoka and Carver County, working with communities that are disproportionately impacted, you know, and deal with a lot of disparities. I also am someone who has, as a policy fellow, worked really looking at health in all equity. So we did work in looking at Hennepin County's policies, looked at the policies in the state, in the city, in Minneapolis public schools and the park system, to try to see what their policies, what the kind of policies that they had and how that was creating a negative health impact, and how we can reverse that and what are some changes that they can do that. And so I think if there's anyone on this stage really that is well equipped to continue to have those conversations and create positive change in that, I would be it.
Former Speaker Anderson Kelleher.
So when I was both a member of the House and Speaker of the House, I worked on environmental and environmental justice issues my entire time in the House. I worked side by side with Keith Ellison as we worked to shut down coal-fired power plants along the riverfront, because one of the biggest ways that we see this impact is through asthma, and it disproportionately is affecting our communities of color. Issues around access to smoking too early in life. So the work that we did to make sure that when you go into a bar and restaurant, you can breathe clean air, that happened while I was Speaker of the House. I think working with communities, those were all community-based efforts done by a diverse group of people to come forward with. And then the very basic piece, which is expanding access to healthcare, whether it was standing up to Tim Pawlenty time and time again as he tried to cut general assistance medical care, taking it all the way to an override, one of the most disappointing moments in the Minnesota House, that no Republican would join us in that override.
Senator Torres-Ray, you've already talked about your experiences and your qualifications working in the Minnesota Senate. Could you talk a little bit about how that would prepare you in Congress?
You know, when I started working on disparities, the work that needed to happen in the ground as an activist was an imperative for me, being a voice. When I then later on, I decided, you know, after 15 years of work, I really need to understand research. So I came over here and I worked with one of the best, Dr. Myers, understanding disparities and how you use the statistically numbers to have an impact. But what I realized today is that the work that we need to do at the federal level and at the state level requires two things: that you have the experience of having worked on the issue directly, not just having talked about it or having part of the conversation, actually designing legislation. You will look into the legislation that I have authored over the 12 years. All of it is through a lens of social justice, and a lot of it has components around cultural competency, what we need to do to eliminate disparities. In Congress is no different. I think that you need to have the experience of how to craft policy that is based on research, but you also need to have the ability to bring coalitions of support that are diverse. The politics of today really require those two things. You could know the issue, you could have the science behind it, but if you don't have the people who are going to exercise the political pressure, you cannot get anything done. And that's what I've done for the last 12 years.
Former Speaker Anderson Kelleher, we begin with you. The question is from Ms. Binger.
I continue to chip away at tens of thousands in student loans, and I'm not alone. Student loan debt in the US has already reached $1.5 trillion. 68% of Minnesota students are graduating with student loan debt, and that's at an average of nearly $32,000. What specific measures will you take in Congress to address this growing debt?
So I speak from personal experience. I'm chipping away at my student debt still from going to graduate school 10 years ago. And the two examples out in the audience, my children, Patrick and Francis, also carry student debt, as well as our family. So I know what this feels like as you try to decide what is best in someone's life going forward. I think that the number one thing we can do is increase the size of the Pell Grant, because for undergraduates, that is the pathway to the future. It's how I, as a poor student coming off of a farm, got to go to Gustavus Adolphus College and was able to make that work. My parents did not have the money to send me to college. I am only the second person in my immediate family to graduate from college, and I have a graduate degree. Most people don't get that opportunity still today. And too many young students just immediately turn off about being able to afford a higher education because they cannot put it together. I think we should have free 2-year college at the associate's level and be able to then move people forward on their 4-year degree.
Senator Torres-Ray.
This is an issue that is incredibly important to me, and I will make it an absolute top priority. We need to pay your debt, and we need to make tuition-free college in this country. And how I'm going to do it is that I'm going to reduce 5% of the defense fund, because we don't need to have military funding that we don't use. The military funding that we have right now going into research for weapons that we may use in case of war, we need to stop it. We need to invest in our kids. Right now, you are correct. 1.2 trillion is the debt that we have, that our kids have. You have millennials right now saying, I'm not going to have a kid. I'm not going to have a house. I'm in debt. There's no way I can pay college, I can pay house, and I can have a kid. How can you have a generation that is thinking about not having a family? This is a tragedy. We bail out the auto industry, we bail out banks, we bail out everyone. I'm going to bail out our kids. I also have a 24 and a 22-year-old right now who are thinking that they don't have a future because they are going to be in debt for the rest of their lives. I am going to bail out our kids. We are going to use defense money to do it. We can do it as a nation because many countries do it. And I am very firm on that.
Representative Omar.
So as I said earlier in my introduction, I'm a millennial with student debt. And I also have a daughter that is graduating high school in 2 years that's going to college soon. And I've had the opportunity to serve in the higher ed committee, working to make sure that we are tackling student debt and trying to work through forgiveness programs, but also trying to make sure that we had investment in our MINSCU system and in our university system so that we are reducing the cost and making college affordable and accessible. I think it is going to be really important for us on a federal level to advocate for the cancellation of student debt. It cost us $2.2 trillion to do the tax cuts and the corporate giveaways, and it's $1.4 trillion to cancel out student debt. If we were prioritizing our values in our budget, we would make sure that we canceled out student debt and freed students and young people to be able to purchase a home, to purchase a car, to start their life, to be able to have kids, to do and make sure that they are reinvesting in our economy. And investment in people means investment in our societies, investment in our economy.
Former Speaker Anderson Kelleher, you get the first follow-up question from Ms. Binger.
As an interim step, what can specifically be done to limit student loan rates?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to add to that, if that's okay, Ms. Binger, that one of the first things that needs to be done is Betsy DeVos must be stopped about her plan to cancel the student debt of the people who went to for-profit colleges that preyed upon them. And right now, there had been an agreement with the Obama administration to cancel this debt out. And now Betsy DeVos single-handedly in her Secretary of Education role is saying, no, we're not going to do that. That is a horrible decision. People didn't even get a degree out of that. And so I think that that's one piece of it. There often have been much higher degree of control on the debt rate. But I just want to say that it is, I think, one of those things that we need to find more innovative ways to help people relieve their debt instead of just the interest rate. But when interest rates rise, we know what happens. The indebtedness rate will drive even higher. And so I do think you've identified something that needs to be federally funded to keep the rate low.
Senator Torres-Ray.
So college tuition has increased at a cost more than any other good or service in this nation. It has grown 2 to 3 times the rate of inflation every single year. So it's totally unprecedented. And we have looked at this, and we know the investments that banks are making, corporations, and creating debt for our kids. And this has happened, over the years. People are talking about this administration and the plans that this administration, this has been happening for the last 20 years. And we have done nothing about it. So we need to curve this down, and we really need to make sure that we follow the example of industrialized countries who have done this. It's not that it's not a possibility. Sweden is doing it. We are number 9 in the nation right now in terms of educated workforce, number 9. And so we have countries ahead of us who actually can do this. And there is a possibility that there is a percentage of students who will have to have loans, but we don't have to have interest. I think that it is incredibly important that we make this investment, because this generates wealth for the country, actually. And we have the statistics for the countries that actually provide free college. So I think that we need to look at this in the long term as an investment, because it is, and we have countries who actually have demonstrated that it is, and it grows their economy.
Representative Omar, just to restate the question, it's about what's an interim step to limit student loan rates. Do you agree with that? It's all yours.
So this is an issue, right, that I pay attention to quite a lot. Did you all know that the interest that is collected on our debt is not put back in funding higher ed? And so I want to make sure that that money actually is being used to reduce the interest rates, and it's being used to actually invest back into education. I'm also one of those students that went to the private colleges that preyed upon them. And so I want to be at the table advocating and making sure that we are having a really honest discussion about what lures young people into that, and what it means for them to lose all of their the money that they get for college, and to actually accrue debt, and to make sure that we're having a really honest conversation about that. So it's going to be really important for us to make sure that we have the money that's coming in going back into the pocket that reinvests in education.
Representative Omar, the next question is from you, and it's from Ms. Pawlowski.
Economic mobility is eroding. 90% of children born in 1940 went on to earn more than their parents. Only 50% of children born in 1985 can say the same. Please give us 2 specific reforms to reverse these troubling trends.
So I think the way that we guarantee economic security for working families really is to make sure that we are increasing and working on legislation to get federal $15 minimum wage. Make sure that we are investing in opportunities for people to buy a home, and that we're making, we're creating opportunities for affordable housing. We also must really invest in our transportation infrastructure and transit to make sure that people have the ability to have more money in their pockets, and have the ability to connect different communities so that people can go and access places where there are jobs.
Senator Torres-Ray.
I think that this question needs to be addressed through two important things. One is really the ability to make more, right? Because clearly we have people who make a ton of money here and people who are not making enough. So that's one aspect of it. And I will definitely support increasing minimum wage to 15 nationwide. We need to do it. But I think the other part to this too is developing the jobs of the future, the economy of the future. Because if we stay in this conversation like we are in Minneapolis talking about, hospitality industry, small restaurants, what are they going to do? Whether whether they will survive or not. If we stay in that conversation, then we are not really able to provide opportunities for workers to really move into good paying jobs. And so the investment into an economy of the future is an essential part of this equation. And I also think it's important that we look at entry jobs, because right now, a lot in our district, we're talking a lot about the people who don't have enough training to get into these jobs. So there are many components associated with this that really ensure that we have, economic security. That there are many aspects to economic security that is not just increasing income.
So I think there's 4 things that can be done here. I think you asked for 3, but I'm going to speak about 4. One is the one we just spoke about, education, and having a public higher education system that's accessible and affordable. Being able to get a 2-year degree, a certificate, or a 4-year degree is very important in this work to be able to bring up the overall ability of people to earn. Second is the 2 most important drivers of how expensive it is to live today: housing and healthcare. And so we've talked about healthcare quite a bit and what we see on healthcare and being able to move that forward. On housing, we need to do something because from a federal point of view, and I think those things that we can do from a federal point of view are be able to hold those private systems accountable with hearings to make sure that more people are able to access the market. We also need to deal with being able to revitalize areas where there is naturally occurring affordable housing and be able to make those homes into and keep them affordable. I'm going to run out of time. The tax code is the 4th thing, and it's lopsided.
Representative Omar, you get the follow-up question first from Ms. Pawlowski.
So there will be separate follow-up questions, actually. But for Representative Omar, you mentioned in a prior question, actually, the federal jobs guarantee. I'm curious, how do you think that plays into this question about economic mobility, and how do you think that might, or critics say that could undermine the value of hard work for low-income families? How would you respond to that aspect of it?
Yeah. I mean, there are many, we know right now that the unemployment rate in Minnesota and in the United States is really low. But we also know, right, that those numbers are sometimes lying to us because there are communities within our communities that are that have higher unemployment rate and don't have really the opportunity to find a job, sustain a job, or have accessibility to a job. And so we want to make sure that federally we are investing in allowing people to maybe work in our park system and have those jobs guaranteed to them. Maybe we're investing in small businesses to have community members work there. I think it is about making sure that we're giving people the opportunity to work and feel dignified in the fact that they're also contributing. And I think economically it makes more sense for us, because once somebody is within workforce, they contribute to the tax base as well.
Senator Torres-Ray, Ms. Pawlowski has a follow-up for you.
You mentioned a $15 federal minimum wage. Would that go far enough to address some of the underlying causes of inequality and of eroding economic mobility? And what else would you have in mind that would address that?
It's a partial answer. It is not the answer. Clearly, we need to look at healthcare. Healthcare is an important issue that we need to address, and especially for everyone, but for businesses in particular. So having access to healthcare for all is an imperative when we talk about economic security. I also think that there is a very specific need on really looking at opportunities for training and opportunities for creating apprenticeship programs for the careers of the future. And one of the most significant challenges that we have right now with some of the cuts that were implemented in the tax bill is that we are reducing the funding for apprenticeship programs, and in one of the most important times in these green industries. So that's an issue that I am planning to pay very close attention, because it's an issue that I think people don't understand how the impact that it will have, for future jobs is really significant. And so with the price of college right now and not having access to apprenticeship programs, we are going to have a significant problem really to address this. So I'm sorry that 1 minute is so fast, but I think it's very important that we look at housing, healthcare, and opportunities for training. I think those are very essential, along with increasing the minimum wage.
Ms. Pulowski has a follow-up question for former Speaker Anderson Kelleher.
You talked about housing and healthcare as two of the main issues here. Do those go far enough to addressing the underlying inequalities, making your dollar stretch further? Is that enough?
Well, I don't think it's enough. I think it gets a good way there if we could really solve the issues of healthcare affordability for all, because it does a couple things. It frees people to do the work that they want to do, wherever that is, at whatever point in our economy that work is happening. I've heard from a lot of people that with the expansion of the ACA, the makers of the world, the people who are creating and artists have been able to finally have a little more security. And I think that's important. I think housing does a similar thing for people. It gives them security. That's one of our values, is having security in the world. It's one of our needs, actually, a very basic one. And so I think there's other things we need to do. I agree that training is important. Apprenticeship is an important part of this, but it goes beyond, much farther beyond. My 4 years on the Minnesota State MnSCU board were important years as chair of the Academic and Student Affairs Committee, where every month I would bring before the entire board the stories of students who were both succeeding and struggling with how to be able to afford higher education.
We're going to go on to the next question, but I'm just going to do a little editorializing here. I want to thank these students. Aren't they awesome?
They are.
I'm probably one of those diseased people who spends too much time around politics, but I've got to say, these are really substantive questions, and they, I think, really add to the necessary conversation around this election. Obviously, the students have worked hard. These are not questions you just pull off a paper. So let's tee up the next one. Senator Torres Ray. It's from Ms. DeSenza.
The St. Paul ICE office, which covers Minnesota, Iowa, the Dakotas, and Nebraska, deported 2,841 people in fiscal year 2017. What role do you think there should be for an agency that enforces immigration in the interior of the country?
I think we have seen the horrors on TV about what ICE is doing right now at the border, and how we have moved into militarizing the border in this country. I think that is incredibly tragic. It doesn't reflect the values of American people, and we need to stop it. We have heard that the nation is behind abolishing ICE, and we need to do it. That does not mean that we're not going to have security at the border. Of course we do. Thousands of people cross the border every day. We have commerce that is important between Mexico and this country. So this is an issue that is very personal to me. There are many people, these people that you talk about, that have been deported. Some of them I actually know. They are part of organizations. They work in our community. They are a member of our community today, and they came here looking for an opportunity. I want you to know this is one of my top priorities. It's a priority for this nation. We must address immigration, and we need to stop the cruelties that are happening at the border. Addressing DACA and TPS will be my absolute top priority on this issue, but we do need comprehensive immigration reform.
Representative Omar.
And I think when we're talking about the issue of immigration and ICE's role in that, I think we have to first recognize how broken our immigration system is. We have to then also talk about how it is not illegal to seek asylum, that everybody should have a right to do that. And I think it is important for us to also remember that ICE is an institution that was put together, that was formed in 2003 under the Patriot Act and the creation of Homeland Security. So when we are looking at the kind of rates that are happening right now, the deportation processes that are beginning, who is being housed in these detention centers, we must recognize that they are people who are being caught up in our broken immigration system. And I think that there is an opportunity for us to do work so that they are not being pushed into that system and they are not being sent back into communities that they fled because they were looking for security and for opportunities.
Former Speaker Anderson Kelleher.
Well, I think in terms of the question on the interior of the country, ICE is gone rogue. ICE is outsized, and ICE needs to be abolished. And we need a new humane immigration and naturalization service, which we had largely for many years. This is a decision by this Trump administration to deport people. It is not it is not what has been going on all of the time, that's for sure. And the spike in the numbers of people being deported has gone way up. So I think that ability to abolish ICE, to have a new immigration naturalization service, and to really impose on that immigration and naturalization service that once you are over this border, we need to have a pathway to citizenship going forward for people.
Okay. Follow-up question.
I just want to say that the deportations have actually
You'll get a sec. You'll get
been happening, and it's not a new thing. Yes, there's a spike,
I understand
but
that.
We'll get into follow-ups. You'll get your chance. And speaking of follow-ups, we've got Ms. DeSenza here teed up for a follow-up for Senator Torres-Ray.
Had an estimated 12.1 million people who were living here without documentation. What, if anything, do you propose to do about that specifically with whatever new immigration agency you would design?
If you look at what is happening right now in many industries in this state right now, there are no workers. We have a problem in rural Minnesota, suburban Minnesota, in Minneapolis. People are talking about shortage of workers. We need immigration. And we are with a generation of millennials that don't want to have children. So what are we going to do? Where do you find workers? You need immigrants. So I think it's a compelling issue. It's an issue that we have to address. And I also have to clarify, the horrors of the border are not new. Now they're being exposed and they are being escalated by really an immoral administration that wants to take it too far. But this is not new. There were hunters in the border killing people. You remember when people would, drop in water in the desert. This is not new. We have been separating families throughout the history of this country. We have separated Native families. I want you to look at a video that I am going to put today, about 54 families living just right next to here in tents right now. All of them women who have children who have been separated. 54 Native women are right now living in tents outside just 2 blocks from here. Separation of Native American families, African American families, and immigrant families is not new. It's part of our history. And we really, really need to look at what it is as a nation that we need to do in order to stop that.
Representative Omar?
The horrors actually of our broken immigration system, right, is one that we're, some of us might actually be realizing right now, but a lot of us who've gone through that process know very well, and who live in communities that are constantly impacted by it know it very well. There was a professor who was picked up by ICE here in Augsburg. We know that he came here legally. But because of how our system is broken, he finds himself in limbo. And so we want to make sure that we are paying attention to strengthening those processes and giving people a clear path. Those who want a clear path to being documented and eventually getting their residency and getting citizenship. We know that there are people who are here with their spouses who are still undocumented because sometimes our system doesn't work. And so we want to make sure that we have an immigration system that is humane, that lives up to our fundamental ideals, that recognizes all of us in this country are here for opportunity, and together we can prosper.
Former Speaker Anderson Kelleher, the question is, what would you concretely propose with regard to the estimated 12.1 million unauthorized immigrants living in America?
Well, I think we do have to have a comprehensive immigration reform, not a piecemeal immigration reform, which is really what Republicans in the Trump administration have been trying to propose here. And so comprehensive is the operative word in that. You know, I carry with me every day the story of Maria, who is a DACA student. She is a dreamer. She came to the country early in her life. And when offered employment, she said back, I'm not sure you want to employ me. She has a biology degree. She's smart. She's tenacious. And the thought was, well, why? And that's because the DACA status for her runs out in August of 2019. Luckily, she is employed, and I think that she is the type of person that we need comprehensive reform, not just for Dreamers and DACA, but for everyone. But I carry with me every day as someone who I know needs us to do this and get it done.
Former Speaker Anderson Kelleher, the next question is for you. It's from Ms. Binger.
So I have a yes or no question. Do you support President Trump's tariffs?
Wow, that is not a yes or no answer, Humphrey students, and you know that.
But she said yes or no question.
A yes or no question. Is this a trick question somehow? I mean, so here's what I would say. Generally, no, because I think we've seen a president who is tariff happy. I mean, so generally no. But on the issue of trade in China, he had started a little bit in the right direction, and now we're way off base. Sorry, I can't do that as yes or no. I don't know if maybe they can do it.
Representative Omar?
I agree. It is not a yes and no. We know that some of the policies right now are really impacting Minnesotans, and so yeah, that would be a no. But I think that there are some real reforms internationally that might get us a yes. So it's one of those that are complicated, and depending on which one you're talking about, we have a different answer.
So yes or no on support for President
You're going to
Trump's
keep trying,
tariffs?
aren't you?
We got follow-ups here. Senator Torres-Ray.
I do not support the way this president proposed these policies because it's not thoughtful and is not helpful and is going to destroy the export sector. So no, I don't support his concept for sure. It's ill-advised, it's not well thought out.
Ms. Binger, follow-up question for former Speaker Anderson Kelleher.
So what would you say to the 3,800 northern Minnesotans who are employed in iron mining who might support President Trump's tariffs because they might save jobs?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that you have identified one of the areas where for the United States it actually is important to have tariff reform. However, I am troubled by the bypass system that's been put in place and what we're reading about here. There's a bypass system for companies where they can apply to use steel from other places. And if you are a company that has given heavily to the Trump administration, the Trump presidency and the election, then you basically get to have veto power over having your say about other companies. Wow, that is really not cool and unethical, I think. And so one of the things that we have to do here is if we're going to have tariffs and trade reform, it needs to be fair as possible for people. And when they're producing important goods and goods for the country, then they need to have a way to bypass some of these tariffs to be able to get what they need. That is one of those that I do believe overall the president, and we know that steel dumping has been going on for a very long time in this country, so something has to be done.
Representative Omar, what do you say to the 3,800 folks in northern Minnesota who are employed in the iron mining?
Yeah. So what I say to them is that, you know, we have a president really who is putting policies together in a very destructive way. So when there is a gain for one particular group, then there is extreme harm for other groups. So we know that our folks with soybeans and pork farmers here in Minnesota are heavily going to be impacted negatively by his policies. So what I would tell them is send us to Washington to be able to be your voice, to make sure that we're having the real conversations on how this is not winner take all, that we need to have a very comprehensive policy put together that really understands where the actual impacts are positively and where the negative impacts could be, and making sure that we're mediating that.
Senator Torres-Ray, as Ms. Binger mentioned, there's support in northern Minnesota for these tariffs. What do you say to those 3,800 workers?
I'll say to these workers that they were lied to and that what it was proposed cannot be done. And they need to understand that if China is going to do retaliation, we're going to lose more jobs. So we're not better off, we're worse off. And that the very industries that are going to be impacted are actually very important industries here in the state of Minnesota. The steel industry, soybean industry, the agricultural industry, dairy industry, manufacturing industry, the list goes on. So it's very simple. The president lied to these individuals, to these workers, propose something that cannot happen, and in fact is going to take us in the opposite direction. So I think the most important thing that we need to tell workers is that we do have opportunities, that we have industries that we can develop, and that this is not the right approach. And they are smart enough, I think they are smart enough to understand that this is really taking the direction in the opposite, this country in the opposite direction.
Ms. Binger, do you have a follow-up question for former Speaker Anderson Kelleher?
What qualifications do you have to shape trade policy?
Mm-hmm. So although as a state legislator, you do not directly work in the trade area, one of the things that I have been very proud and able to do is teach negotiation and mediation for 15 years here at the Humphrey School with a really, I think, a place where I get to keep up to date on all of these international negotiations and mediations, plus my experience getting a degree from Harvard's Kennedy School, where over half of my class came from somewhere else outside of the United States. It was a huge learning for me to be able to study economics at the Kennedy School and be able to take that forward into Congress. So those things are things that really contribute. Plus, I grew up on a small family farm. Two of my brothers still farm today. They are 70 years old farming. That's also a trend in Minnesota farmers. They are very distressed by the tariffs. I think they'd be okay if I told you they did not vote for Donald Trump as well, because they predicted this would come in terms of the issues with the tariffs and what's happening to our farmers right now.
Representative Omar, question is about qualifications to handle trade policy.
Good for your brothers.
Yeah, it's hard work.
So I've had, I think, really a unique experience. Being elected as the first really made it so that I would have very unique conversations with a lot of embassies across the world. That I would get visitations from embassy representation. So I've had a really very in-depth conversation with the Canadian embassy and talking about the kind of impacts that these proposed trade policies would have for them. And I think there isn't really anyone who has had the kind of extreme crash course with world leaders and embassies and MPs around the world in trying to really talk about what globalization means, what the global economy can do, what the impact of refugees and immigrants can have on our economies, what it looks like for us to utilize our aid in positive ways. And I think in that aspect, I have a very global lens, a different kind of experience, and the kind of connections I think that will make that transition into being a congressperson very easy.
Senator Torres-Ray, question about qualifications and trade policy.
So as Margaret just stated, we do a lot of, obviously, state policy and foreign policy is not something that we do unless you are an immigrant. Because when we talk about issues around immigration and commerce and participation on commissions to do trade between countries, we're typically asked. And in fact, people around the world don't know that I am a state senator. They think that I am a US senator. So a lot of people from Latin America, when they come to visit the governor, they will call my office and they will say, we really want to meet with the governor. We are partnering with Cargill. Actually, Cargill has a lot of industries in Colombia, for instance. So we have hosted a number of ambassadors who have come to work here. And so I do a lot of that in terms of connecting state policy with global policy and many of the companies that are here, 3M, Cargill, just to name a few. So I am I participate quite often in conversations around trade. And right now I am having a conversation with 11 reservations around opening trade between Native American people Native people of the Americas. And this conversation actually was started by Al Franken when he was in the Indian Affairs Committee. And it's a conversation we started 4 years ago in order to trade coffee from Chile all the way to Canada. So it's a very important conversation for Minnesota, for Indian people. So there's a lot of conversations that many times take place at the state level, but we have global companies in this state that really connect with the world, and we're part of those conversations.
We're going to begin the next question with you, Senator Torres-Ray, and it's from Ms. Pawlowski.
The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office is projecting a 16% increase in the U.S. budget deficit in the current fiscal year, on its way to a $1.5 trillion deficit by 2028. How do you reconcile your new program spending with the risk of further burdening future generations?
And that increase was done by an administration that really promised to do exactly the opposite, and a Congress that promised to do exactly the opposite, to live within our means, and they are doing the opposite. So it has not worked for the Republicans either, who make empty promises. So I am a Democrat who believes very strongly that we need to invest in people. And I think that if you look at that budget very closely, 55% of that budget goes to defense. And it goes into technology for really talking about war. That's what this administration is talking about right now. So that's where we need to cut the spending. It is very clear. We need to invest in education. We need to invest in healthcare. We need to invest in growing our economy through jobs of the future. And we need to cut spending in defense. That is my bottom line, because that's where 50% of that budget went to. And cuts for the 1% richest people in this country who actually own the industries of war. That's the same people owning all of the wealth of this country and leaving 99%
Thank
of
you.
us
We've run out of time on
out
that.
of that prosperity.
Okay, so
Former
yes,
Speaker
I
Anderson
think
Keller.
that paying attention to the deficit and actually paying down the deficit is a really critical issue. I agree that I think defense spending can be reduced in this budget. I also believe the tax cut that really benefited the wealthiest people, the billionaires, the corporations. And what we see now today is, again, one of those, I think, falsehoods of tax cuts, which is the idea or the notion that people are going to invest in their people. They're going to invest in the infrastructure. No, you know what they're doing? They're buying back stock right now to be able to make themselves wealthier. And so this is the wrong direction, and it really, those two things alone would help shave off much of that 1.5 trillion projected deficit.
Representative Omar, last word.
I mean, we're here now because we have had budgets that really do not represent our values. And I think it's really going to be important for us to advocate and have conversations about putting budgets together that represent our values. Yes, we need to cut the defense fund. It's grown by 50% since 9/11. We know that there are Pentagon contracts that are costing $25 billion. God knows what they do. We see, right, like that there is corporate tax cuts that are costing us, and we know that the trickle-down economics has not worked, and it's not something that works. So if we are serious about making sure that we are growing our economy, that we're able to reinvest in our economy, we must cancel out student debt. We must make sure that we are investing in education, that we invest in infrastructure and 21st century infrastructure, that we're creating new industries. That is really how we put a budget together that has our real values in place.
Well, that brings to an end our conversation with the candidates. I want to give a quick round of thanks. First, I want to begin. Just give me 1 second. I want to thank Kathy Thunheim for terrific support of the Humphrey School and her welcome. I want to thank these remarkable students who spent 6 weeks thinking about the topics. There were a lot of conversations, and you didn't hear any questions about Donald Trump and impeachment and some other topics, and that was their decision. They wanted to talk about the real policy issues, and we thank the candidates for putting up with what we call the Humphrey treatment. We ask hard questions about real policy issues. I want to also give a thanks to several students who worked very hard in organizing this, Carissa Kemp, Mike Sun, and our super organizer, Sophie Wallerstedt. Once again, please thank these great candidates.